Welcome to this fourth webcast of the African European Parliamentarians Initiative during the COVID-19 pandemic. Last year, COP25 was held in Madrid in December. A few weeks later, we got the news about the coronavirus from China, and suddenly the whole world closed down. So we are really living in a very special time and very far from what many of us thought would be the major topic for 2020, that is COP26 in Glasgow. In 2019, we had a wave of Fridays for Future around the world. Young people raised their voices demanding world leaders to save the planet, their future. What happened to their claims? Our aim in this discussion today is to restore the urgency of climate change negotiations. We have two huge challenges before us, and radical action should be taken to both emergencies at once, the global pandemic and the climate emergency. So today we want to discuss why COP26 was postponed and what are its chances of success when it takes place next year. What is the meaning of this new concept to build back better? Can it deliver something more radical in how we rebuild the world after COVID-19? And more positively, what can we do as Africans and Europeans working together, using our best ideas and our most determined actions? And that's why I'm delighted to introduce this panel of champions for environmental justice from the north and south of the world. In a few moments, we're going to hear from Stella Gama, who is both a scientist and a forestry expert from Malawi, and the technology spokeswoman for the least developed countries group of climate negotiators. And we're going to hear from Mr. Tanguy Gahouma from Gabon, who is also an expert on mapping forests and is the chair of the African group of climate negotiators. We're also going to hear from Jannie Staffansson, who has represented the Saami people in the north of Europe with great distinction and is herself a reindeer herder. And later on, we will hear from Bob Ward from the LSE Grantham Institute for Climate Change. Bob will give us his view of what is going on in the United Kingdom, as the UK are the host of COP26. But for our first contribution, I want to introduce Peter Eriksson from Sweden. Peter is the Minister for International Development Cooperation. He's my colleague in the Swedish Green Party, where he was the male spokesperson for many years. And prior to his current role, Peter was Minister for Housing and Digital Development. As an MEP, he served on the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy. Peter, on the government's website, you say, the world is facing major challenges. We are seeing democracy being eroded globally, while climate change is becoming an increasingly urgent problem and poverty appears to be gaining a foothold in parts of Africa. Sweden's development cooperation must strengthen democracy and help to create a more sustainable and peaceful world. So I hope you can tell us how you think we can build back a better, more sustainable world after COVID-19, as well as telling us about the work of the Swedish Development Agency. All speakers you have been asked to give your initial remarks for 5 minutes, and you will have the possibility to comment each other's speeches during questions and answers. So Peter, the floor is not yours, but the screen is. So would you like to begin?
Thank you so much, Bodil. And ladies and gentlemen, global friends, the free world and the open society as we know it has partly been shut down. Factories have had to close as global value chains have been severely interrupted. People have lost their jobs, and politicians with nationalistic agendas have pointed their fingers on someone else in the search for someone to blame when faced with the weaknesses of their own societies. A pandemic will not last forever, but its effect will be felt for years to come. This is a time for a reflection on what is the next steps and fundamentally important to human life. The Secretary General of the UN has repeatedly called for world leaders to wake up to reality before our very eyes and led by action and not merely by words. The pandemic is a powerful reminder of that our world is interconnected. We cannot separate health from wider issues in society such as education, gender inequality, rule of law, and the economy. People's health is closely linked to sustainability and the health of our planet. By addressing the climate and biological diversity, we can also improve the wealth and health of human beings, and we are all in this together. Investments are key for how we are building our common future. The pandemic should be the time for us all to say that this is the moment for change. No more investments in fossil fuels. Building back better and greener must be the focus for us all. Renewable energy and digitization can give us answers on how to reach out to everyone with a sustainable technology without destroying our heritage. The world needs to lower emissions by at least 7% every year until 2030. That is, if we should have any chance of staying within reasonable, safe limits for the human society. So why do we still go on subsidizing and investing in fossil fuels? I believe that the young generation, of whom many now are losing their first jobs, are expecting us to kickstart nothing less than an economic transformation without precedent. The extensive use of pesticides and large agriculture fields with monocultures are devastating for birds, pollinators, bees and other insects, and for all of us. The rate of species extinctions is accelerating, and the tiny honeybee and other pollinators are essential for human food security. We also know that the clear-cutting of large forests is taking us to a situation where we're setting the climate on the whole planet at risk. On top of this, the world top scientists are these days also warning us that there is a connection between the destruction of the natural world and a pandemic like COVID-19. They point to a spillover effect of diseases when more and more people are brought into contact and conflict with wild animals. And I'm convinced that this is only by building an open society that it's just, transparent, inclusive gender balance, and certainly free from destructing environmental activities that we can build a future that is sustainable, which we all want. We can still prevent the worst by continuing to analyze and better understand the links between climate change, the loss of biological diversity, and human security. We can prevent future crises by building strong institutions, supported by a vibrant civil society, and by building a global common trust and a common understanding that we are in this together. COVID-19 reminds us that the world is indeed in desperate need of a Green New Deal. Building back better and greener is really an ambitious implementation of the Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement. Sweden has a strong commitment through our bilateral and multilateral development cooperation to address climate change and biodiversity and to assist countries in building back greener, more resilient and more sustainable out of the COVID crisis. But other countries must walk the same path. Now we need to see that all the money that comes out from the World Bank, IMF and the governments to kickstart the economies around the world goes in a direction that takes us all from the cliff we are standing beside and takes us to the planet, to a safer place where we can deliver a more sustainable future to next generations in both Africa, Europe, and the rest of the planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Eriksson. Thank you very much for that contribution. We're going to move on next to the chair of the African Group of Negotiators on Climate Change, who's Mr. Tanguy Gahouma. Mr. Gahouma, would you like to begin?
Thank you very much, Simon. And thank you all for the invitation. On behalf of the African Group and my government, I would like to thank the organizer for convening this important meeting and also for the invitation for the African Group to share the views on this topic. Dear colleagues, the year 2020 will be remembered for the global health crisis and the rapid spread of the COVID-19 around the world. This pandemic has caused profound and extreme damage to global human health, society, and substantial economic instability across the world. We are facing a global crisis, which requires immediate and decisive action to save lives and overcome the social and economic consequences of the pandemic. In terms of Africa, the continent was already faces major development crisis. It is extremely significant and it is seriously testing our resilience. Even for today, we can see a form of stabilization. We cannot ignore that we as the world, we were not prepared to respond rapidly to this pandemic, despite the effort for the government to find an immediate solution and drastic measures. According to recent reports of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, COVID-19 pandemic arrived at a moment when African countries had a promising forecast of economic growth. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 is only a small sample of what might happen if we do not consider the climate emergency that we are facing today, and if we continue to ignore the scientific warning that we have reached a tipping point. Before the impact of COVID-19, the African continent was facing unprecedented pressure owing to various extreme weather events and slow onset events accentuated by climate change. And these have significantly affected our agricultural production and significantly affecting food security. It is expected that COVID-19 will exacerbate this impact of climate change on the continent. We need to address a similar focus and resources devoted to COVID-19 to address the threat of climate change. We cannot afford to put the climate emergency on hold. Consequently, it is essential to take note of the lesson learned from COVID-19 on the importance of preparedness and action by nation for climate change. COVID-19 have exposed our global vulnerabilities and highlighted the need for building resilience. Adaptation and building resilience being the priority of our continent, as our total emissions are negligible. There is a strong need to channel a similar focus and replicate the level of resources devoted to COVID-19 to address the threat of climate change. The African group has stressed the urgency of taking climate action, and the implementation of the Paris Agreement should reflect the three goals of the Paris Agreement that are equally important aspects of ambition. It's ambition on indices, ambition on adaptation goal, and ambition on means of implementation. COP26 has the COP before the start of the implementation of the Paris Agreement should facilitate the implementation of climate action that contribute to reducing emission and climate resilience. Unfortunately, COP26 was postponed to next year as the implementation of the Paris Agreement will begin in 2021. It is therefore crucial that Build Back Better, or the recovery plan from COVID-19, is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. This is important for countries with higher emission and capacity to align their recovery plan with their climate effort to address the two challenges of our time. It is also important these countries lead by example the effort on climate action for identifying sustainable development pathway. The African group recognized the effort of EU, for example, in including the EU recovery plan, taking into consideration climate change and the goals of Paris Agreement. The African group is of the view that the recovery plan after COVID-19 for African countries is a great opportunity to reorienting development trajectories to low greenhouse gas emission strategy and promoting sustainable development. The EU and African countries have a long bilateral partnership on trade, development cooperation, security, and are united on the climate agenda. The EU countries have supported African countries to take ambitious action on climate change. We see such support continuing for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. African countries have initiated a process for revising and updating their indices following the invitation of the presidency of COP25. It is also essential to take note that there is a clear and undeniable link between levels of support provided and, in particular, provision of financial resources, and the level of ambition and climate action by developing countries in line with achieving the goal of staying well below 2 degrees. However, the UNFCCC and OECD report indicate the long-term goal for mobilizing and allocating the 100 billion USD will not be reached this year. We also have noted that the ODA to developing countries, in particular to African countries, has decreased. It is therefore vital to close the climate finance gap, to facilitate the preparation of ambitious, updated and revised NDCs. The support is also essential for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Finally, my dear colleagues, there is an opportunity to recover our global economies in a manner that builds more sustainable, inclusive, and resilient society in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goal, and the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. We should not seek to restore the pre-pandemic statu quo. What is required is a paradigm shift, strengthening multilateral cooperation and a strong commitment in a post-COVID world needs more than ever to ensure that no region or country is left behind, especially the most vulnerable to long-term climate impact. The EU remains a key partner to Africa. We should join forces to promote the Build Back Better recovery that is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. It should be a win-win situation. I want to thank you again for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanguy Gahouma. I'm sorry I was let out from internet for a couple of minutes there, but I've been listening to all your speech there. We go straight forward to Jannie Staffansson. Very welcome, Jannie.
Thank you. My name is Jannie Staffansson, and I'm a reindeer herder living in the Arctic. My people are Saami, indigenous peoples of Sweden, Norway, Finland, and Russia. And as indigenous peoples, we are, of course, heavily affected by climate change. Indigenous peoples have a strong connection to the nature. We have for a long time watched and listened to the nature telling us that something big is happening. Climate change has been ever present in my life. And that change is something that my grandparents did not experience. So in this generation, we are trying to figure out what's going on. How can we help nature? How can we help Mother Earth and biodiversity to adapt? That knowledge took me to COP. And I was a part of delivering out the Paris Agreement, where we fought very hard that the indigenous people's rights need to be respected in the Paris Agreement. We cannot have yet another driving force taking indigenous people's land when we are trying to protect biodiversity, protect our culture, our livelihoods, and help and assist Mother Earth in this struggle. Unfortunately, that respect of indigenous people's rights did not make it into the Paris Agreement. And that has implications, because right now we need to move from fossil fuels. We need to leave all this destructive business behind and look to a brighter future, which COVID has given us an opportunity to actually do, to try to vision and experience and live and reconnect with nature and what is important in our lives to build this new future. But we need to have the best available knowledge in order to do that. We need to figure out what's going on with nature. And for that, we need all the voices, and particularly the voices of the indigenous peoples. As IPCC says, science and indigenous knowledge need to be in the forefront and need to be the basis of where we put our decisions at. With that said, indigenous peoples are the guardians of 80% of the world's biodiversity. In Sweden today, the old forests are on indigenous people's lands, and we are trying very hard to protect all of that nature and the biodiversity, not just for nature itself or us, but for food security, for healthy water, for fresh air, to protect those small worlds that are in a lake, that are in the forests. We can't have, as Peter said, monocultures destroying that. We need to build better. I'm convinced that EU can do so much better, but we need to have something in place. We need to have the obligations to not destroy those worlds, to protect indigenous people's rights, to protect biodiversity, because the industry will not just do that without policies having them saying it will. And with COVID, we have actually experienced policy being very, very strict, even with industry. And if we can challenge that, and if we can channel that in building this world better, I think that we are onto something that will assist us in economic growth, in reducing poverty, in having more fresh air and clean water, and securing food. Whereas we are also fighting climate change and making the world better together. With that, my suggestions would be that you have in the NDCs, for example, the states put it in how they respected indigenous people's rights, how they did just transition when they transitioned into greener energy without building mega power windmill parks on indigenous people's land, destroying these worlds that we do have, that we need to protect. How can we have a just transition and transit into a better future without killing small worlds? That is something we need to figure out, and we need to do it together. Not only policy, not only industry, not only indigenous peoples, but together as a society with a vision of doing something and creating something that will be truly sustainable, and not only using the word sustainable in every way that we wish. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Janine. And then we go directly to Stella. Welcome, Stella.
Thank you very much and good afternoon. I am Stella Gama from Malawi, and I work with the least developed countries group at the UNFCCC, also after the last conference of the parties. And this was in terms of finalizing the post-2020 plans and also the commitments. We were looking forward to new approaches for addressing the climate crisis. We were also looking forward to evaluating the revised commitments under the Paris Agreement in terms of emission reductions, enhanced support for adaptation actions, but also finance. And I believe my colleague from the AGN has talked about the 100 billion target. So we were looking forward to that. Yes, the postponement is inevitable since we have to prioritize people's health. However, we need not delay climate action. The process towards meeting these post-2020 plans and commitments should also be a parallel priority. And such processes should ensure that the voices of the most vulnerable countries, the peoples of the vulnerable countries, the men, the women, the boys and girls, and all the people are not excluded at any point and at any stage. We have two crises at hand. Is it crisis or crises? Crisis. The climate change and now the COVID pandemic. So we have a double crisis. And these have caused double devastation to the poor, even more, because we have the climate change, we have the disease, the COVID, and then we also have poverty amongst us. So we have so many crises. And these are taking away people's livelihoods. The crises are taking away people's lives in our poor countries. There are so many shocks. And with each shock exacerbating the last, being exacerbated by the last one. And in this regard, we are setting back any efforts that we have undertaken on development. And we're also setting back our efforts on climate action. And that is also livelihoods, the livelihoods of the men, and especially the women. And you may wish to be reminded that in such circumstances where we have double or triple crisis, the women suffer more because of the multiple roles that they have to play in society. They also have to take care of the sick, and they have to take care of the households and provide for livelihoods, and yet maybe access to finances, access to technology to support their households under such crisis is not adequate. However, it is also our expectation, the least developed countries, that by the end of 2020, parties will still submit the NDCs as we committed. And that these will have plans for deep cuts in emission reduction, with plans for increased support for the LDC vulnerable countries. And we expect that these goals should be at the forefront of all governments, considering governments' considerations as they make plans for recovery from the pandemic. The postponement of the COP26 to 2021 should provide us with an opportunity to reshape our policies, taking into consideration this pandemic. Cooperation, as it has been highlighted, is important. We need to cooperate. Bilateral engagement, bilateral actions are also vital under these circumstances. However, these should be considered as approaches, inputting and supporting the multilateral processes. Everybody should be included and none excluded. The two crises are together. They are in coexistence. We still have the climate change crisis still outstanding. We need to show the same commitment we have shown to the health pandemic, the same commitment to the climate crisis. We need to define, redefine the climate response to with the same momentum as the COVID response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stella. Now you've all had the possibility to give your initial remarks and speeches. So we go on to some questions. You've had very, very interesting remarks, all of you. I wanted to make this question part in three parts, but I take them all together because I see that we all agreed that the postponement of COP26 was necessary. I do think that we all agree on that. But how shall we go further? What happens after when we go to the next postponement? No, not the next postponement. What is the significance of the postponement of COP26, and how do you feel about are you positive about the outcome? How do you feel about what can we achieve in the next COP in Glasgow, especially when we have the situation with the US and China, and they are we will have a presidential election. We know, shall we wait for them, or shall we go further on our own? And your negotiation positions, all of you, if you have any specific ones you already want to mention. We have also the situation of how to go further. We have the possibility to legislate, and we have the economy, of course. We have a principle that says that the polluter pays principle. So who is paying? We know that in the beginning, the rich world, we have created a problem really, and the poorer world are those who are suffering the consequences even more. But for example, now in Europe and in many of the countries, we are having national legislations. We create national climate laws. We legislate a lot to reduce emissions and to reduce also the fossil fuels. At the same time, we have also the extractive industry in Africa. Many countries in Africa, they are depending on the extractive industry very much. And those who are benefiting are also the Europeans. So who should pay, and how shall we interpret polluter pays principle in this case? And you spoke about the bilateral and unilateral actions. Could they be more practical to use than through international organizations? Can we come back to the legislation? Can we also reach a post-extractivist world by legislating? Can we put all this to the COP26? And we also have the question about ecocide. To make ecocide as a crime, could we do that in national law? Could we do it in international law? And there's something else also. What have we learned that we can use post-corona as activists, as governments, as negotiators? What have we learned from the past that we can use now? And the last question in all these, you can just pick the ones you like. Who will be the agents of change to find new models of trade and industry, and sustainable, not only by the word sustainable, but also in action really? Those are a lot of different questions, of course, but you pick the ones you like, and you have also the possibility to comment on your colleagues and what they have said during their speeches. I think I give the word, well, first to Peter, as you started. Peter, are you there?
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes, I do.
Oh, fine. I think you must try to be an optimist. It's not so easy all the time, but in this situation, you see the good things by this postponing of the COP. It gives us all a moment for realizing that we need a much tougher agreement, much stronger agreement than even the Paris Agreement did. And I think there is some good signs. The young people of the world have shown a growing awareness about what is happening, and also when we see what is happening in Europe, there are some good things that are happening. We see that the emission trade system for once is functioning now. It has meant that a lot of the coal mines are shutting down in Europe, and the use of coal is getting much less than before. I think the discussion around that we have to also use the international trade systems and agreements, international trade in the climate perspective, much more effective. That is also very important and could be a key to make a change, for example, in the relations against China. And when you talk about China, and there are still a very important part of their economy is on exports, and if the exporting countries or the importing countries from China are using this, it could be important. And also in the next phase, also to see the agreement discussions in Scotland when we are coming there. But also I think we have some hope that the United States are in next year in a better position to be a part of this global agreement and what is happening there. So I think we have some good signs, but the problem is that every year that goes without taking big steps in the right direction is a lost year in a way, and we need the effect is that we need even tougher solutions when we are delaying the work.
Thank you. So I lost you again. Thank you, Peter. And so then the word goes to Mr. Tanguy Gahouma.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Maybe I can talk a little bit about the postponement of the COP26, because for us it was maybe the most important challenge we face because of this crisis. The African group sent an official letter to the Secretariat because we want to be sure that everybody can understand the consequences of this postponement. So we face the vulnerability of our countries about the negative impact of climate change, and we say that we need to stand, of course, with solidarity with the countries affected by COVID-19, and stress the importance for all nations to continue to build momentum for ambitious climate action. Everybody knows that 2020 is a special year. It's the year for the completion of the rules of the Paris Agreement, and it is also the year to communicate about the new NDCs. As well, that at the 1st January 2021, we need to start the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So due to the COVID, 2020 has seen the postponement of many events which are crucial in that way. And we need to stress and to emphasize the urgency for all nations to take ambitious action collective to climate change. So also it is something really important. It's not the Paris Agreement will start next year, and one aspect of the Paris Agreement is to reach the 100 billion per year, and this is it's not normal that because of COVID-19 we cannot see any effort in that way for a developing country to provide clear information, clear communication about the way they will reach this goal for us. So this is actually something very important for us, and we stress every day that it's not because of the postponement of COP26 that we are not commit to the obligation of the Paris Agreement, because it starts now in 4 months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then Jannie.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. No, thank you for all of those questions. I would love to touch upon all of them, but what I think is most important to say is that, of course, not having COP was a huge setback. It was something we needed because we didn't know what COVID-19 really was about. However, we do know what climate change crisis is about, and we do know how to stop it. We need to reduce our emissions. We need to find the finance to do the actions to support those that are most vulnerable. And that finance appeared when we dealt with COVID-19. And that is, of course, something that civil society and public should take with them, that all of this financing actually reappeared in some countries in EU when COVID hit. The issue is that that finance is not available to the same extent when it comes to dealing with the climate change crisis, which is for many people around the world, which is more impacting in a severe way than COVID, as we've heard of Miss Stella. And I think that that is something that we really need to take with us to COP26, that ambitious politics and ambitious actions that we had when we dealt with COVID, how can we apply that in a structure that will create this sustainability? How can we take responsibility of our financing and the channeling of financing to ensure that indigenous people's rights, for example, are not violated by the Paris Agreement or a green transition? How can we protect women? How can we protect the children with that financing? So we do not with that financing, we do not create a more difficult world for those who are protecting biodiversity, who are protecting the climate, until we figure out how to do it in a way internationally with legislation, because that is a difficult thing, in particular when we have US and China. But EU can be at the forefront with that. Small nations can be at the forefront with that. And also, of course, what can we do with COP25 or 26? And can we wait for those other countries? As far as I know, is that climate change is not waiting for anyone. It's happening right now. It's a huge catastrophe, even for us, and it's particularly in the Arctic. I know that climate change isn't waiting for me to deal with COVID when I need to tend to the reindeer and tend to Mother Earth at the same time. But I would really, really encourage people that can affect that, to take that responsibility and ease it for us that are dealing with climate change and COVID at the same time.
Thank you, Jannie. And then finally, I go to Stella. Hello. Hello.
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much. As I said earlier on, out there, because of the postponement, there is uncertainty. People think that this would store further ambitions on emission reductions. Considering that, the current pledges are insufficient to meet the 1.5 or the 2-degree goal. And also, in addition to that, it is the issue of mobilizing the 100 billion. So those are some of the uncertainties out there. So for us as least developed countries, we feel it is critical that all governments, and particularly those governments of wealthy nations, currently making stimulus plans to build their economies back to ensure that the spending is consistent with steep emission reductions, and that these are aligned with the 1.5 degree pathways, and of course, the goals of the Paris Agreement. On our side, as least developed countries, although we are among the most vulnerable and also the most hit by COVID and climate impacts, we are determined to update our NDCs. And by the end of 2020, almost 20 countries have committed to communicating their revised NDC. So that is almost 50% of these poor countries. Earlier on, I talked about the impacts of the COVID, the climate exacerbating reduced livelihood options and also loss of life to poor people, countries people in the poor countries. It is tough. I have a personal example myself. I'm a civil servant with a steady income. When I got sick, I had my mother, who is beyond 75, looking after me. It was a challenge on her. Because I have a steady income, she is able to take care of me without doing a lot of work. But there are women out there who cannot even keep their sick in isolation. They don't have food to give their sick people nutritious food for them to get back to good health quickly. So it is real down there to have so many crises in a community. We need to get rid of some of the crises. And one which we can tackle easily is the climate change by working on our commitments in terms of emission reduction, in terms of financing, and also in terms of supporting the communities on the ground to be resilient to the climate shocks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. I now hope, even though I didn't get answers on all my questions, but I will go further to Bob Ward directly, because otherwise we won't keep schedule. And so and Bob Ward, as I said before, comes from the economics, Center for Economic Studies in the School of Economic Studies in Great Britain. You will have the COP26 in Glasgow. Could you give us some remarks on the way forward?
Yes, thank you very much. And it's been very interesting listening to this discussion. I want to highlight developments alongside COP26. I think many of the speakers have already outlined many of the priorities. There are an expectation that countries come forward with more ambitious pledges ahead of COP26 that will take us hopefully to the target, or at least closer to the temperature target outlined in the Paris Agreement. There are lots of areas we need to see progress in. We need to have the rich countries honor their commitment on the 100 billion, as a number of speakers pointed out. But one of the critical areas we need to understand that there is progress going on and to encourage it is that this is regarded, there is a greater understanding of the link between environmental damage and the health of the economy. And the pandemic has helped to emphasize that. Previous speakers have talked about the fact that as we end up with greater encroachment of human populations on ecosystems and road ecosystems, it brings humans and animals into greater conflict. That increases the possibility of diseases jumping across the species boundary. And so we can already see there the link between economic damage and environmental damage. But if you look wider, you can see interlinkages with the other big global environmental problems, air pollution and climate change. With climate change, we see that both in terms of reducing emissions, if we deforestation hampers that, deforestation damages biodiversity, it damages the natural capital of countries. Air pollution is linked to the both use of biomass, again that creates pressures on existing natural capital, and also by the burning of fossil fuels, which we know is creating is the major driver of climate change. So we can see increasingly, and I think around the world, economic and finance ministries beginning to understand that environment is not a rival to economic growth and development. It's absolutely central to it. And if we ignore the health of the environment, we end up undermining the economy. Now, it's taken a while for economic and finance ministries to engage, but I think there are now signs of that countries are beginning to do that. And we had the creation of the important coalition of finance ministers for climate action last year. It has now grown to more than 50 finance ministries are now members of it, and they have been working hard over the past few months on the linkages between the economic recovery packages coming out of the pandemic and enhancing and accelerating the transition towards sustainable economic growth and development. Essentially, all investments that should be made in bringing us out of the pandemic need to be consistent with our overall environmental goals. Otherwise, they will undermine future economic growth and development. We understand that as climate change increases in its impacts, it creates a greater drag on the economy. We understand that air pollution, particularly in our major developing cities, is an increasing cost. And to give us an understanding of the scale, I draw attention to a paper by the International Monetary Fund that was published a couple of years ago that calculated that the failure to take into account the damage caused by fossil fuel use, both through air pollution and through climate change, meant that the indirect and direct subsidies given to fossil fuels globally every year is $5.3 trillion. That's an enormous sum. It's about 6% of global GDP each year spent on indirect and direct subsidies for fossil fuels. So it is a large investment that is being made that is often not taken into account in the decision making by countries. But I think economics and finance ministry are beginning to understand that there's no such thing as cheap fossil fuels. Once you add in the costs that fossil fuels create through climate damage and through air pollution, these fossil fuels are no longer look cheap. They look very expensive indeed, and they're often paid for through damage to people's lives, directly through ill health or through injury, through natural disasters and other impacts. Alongside that economic leadership that we're now beginning to see by economic and finance ministries, and this is my last point, is we have to see greater political leadership. Ahead of Paris, we saw China and the United States creating leadership by a year out, announcing their intended nationally determined contributions. Unfortunately, as we now know, the United States has now stepped back, is no longer providing leadership on climate change. We hope that the election in November will either lead to a radical change in the attitude of the Republican Party if Donald Trump is returned, or indeed we will see Joe Biden, and he has already set out an ambitious program of domestic and international climate action, and indeed has pledged to rejoin the Paris Agreement. However, we cannot afford to wait, and we do need to see Europe, Africa, and China all work together over the next 15 months to raise the profile of the big international agreements on this. We have the COP15, very important COP15 meeting of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which was due to take place this year, has been postponed and is going to be hosted by China. There is a big overlap between stopping biodiversity loss and tackling the climate emergency. But the loss of biodiversity undermines our efforts to reduce emissions. It undermines our climate resilience. You know, if you lose mangrove swamps, it often means that tropical cyclones become more damaging when they come on land. So we need greater working together of the African governments, the European governments, and I include, for the time being, the UK in that. The UK must work very closely with the EU, Africa, and China so that we make progress both on CBD, the COP15 for CBD, and indeed on COP26. And we need that critical relationship to be based on a better understanding of the importance of recognizing that the health of the environment and the health of the economy are not alternatives. They go together. You cannot have one without the other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. As you all have noticed, I have had some problems with my internet connection. It's like that when you live in the countryside, and so I had to jump between my phone and my computer, but I hope I will manage further on. You have got some questions from the audience, and I will directly pass on to that. You have two, I think, here. The first one is, where does the panel think the burden of responsibility lie in climate action? The public, governments, or industry? There is another one. Paris was a diplomatic success by the French. Are the British or Scottish capable of repeating that success in COP26 next year? And then I have another one. I believe we all agree that this is an emergency, that we have to work very, very urgent and quickly with the climate change questions, and that we need to restore this dialogue, this discussion in society. But are you confident that we can do it? Because we agree, but there are so many others out there. Are you confident we can restore it? Okay, I should start from the end this time, maybe, Bob?
Thank you very much. Let me deal perhaps with the direct question about the UK and its leadership of COP26. The UK, as you know, is not just dealing with the pandemic, but it's also in negotiating with the European Union for a deal following its departure for the European Union. And so there is a risk that all of these factors can distract the UK from the very important job of leading on the negotiations for COP26. I hope that we have very capable people within the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, as it will be following the merger of the Department for International Development and Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and within the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And I believe that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson is also very much committed to making sure that COP26 is a success. But as people will know, COP presidencies can only do so much, and it's really down to the parties as to how successful we can be ultimately. The UK, I think, one of the most important things it can do is lead by example, and it has been able to show over the past few years that it's been able to reduce its territorial emissions of greenhouse gases whilst growing economically. And that's an important lesson to show around the world. It can no longer be an excuse, oh, we can't afford to reduce emissions, it damages the economy. That's the argument that Donald Trump has tried to make. It's entirely false. And many countries are understanding that that's a false argument. So the UK needs to lead by example, and it is shown, for instance, by the use of extra carbon pricing on top of the EU emissions trading system, that has been able to phase out coal much more quickly from its power system than otherwise would have been possible. It has invested very heavily in offshore wind and has brought down the cost. These are models for how the rest of the world can indeed make this transition, speed up the transition as they come out of the pandemic by investing more strongly in the zero carbon technologies that will drive future growth and development, and very quickly accelerating out of the fossil fuels which are causing damage to the environment, causing damage to the economy. I just want to draw attention to the concept that Janine mentioned before, the concept of the just transition. And it very, in its most limited form, it means helping deal with those workers who will lose their jobs in the high carbon industries. We cannot ignore them. They deserve to be part of the transition, and we have to find jobs to put those people back to work. If they moved out of coal mining, we need to redeploy them in other parts of the economy, and we need to help those regions and those countries that are very dependent on high carbon industries to diversify their economies so that they can grow in a clean way out of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Bob. And then I will give the floor to Stella.
Thank you very much. I also got disconnected, so I only got the first part of your question, and that's what I will address. Who has a bigger role, whether it's the public, the industry, or a government? I would say simply, everybody has got a role. If we are to meet our targets, everybody has to play a role. The public, as a person, as an individual, I need to make a personal commitment to probably consumption patterns, because these collectively, they are impacting on our emissions, are impacting on our environment, or the emission reductions. If we look at government simply, it is to set the climate agenda at national level or at local government level. And when that agenda is set, we need to provide the enabling policy frameworks, enabling economic frameworks, environmental frameworks, and also to regulate those policies set and ensure that the industry is complying to those policies and laws that have been set for a particular country to achieve its climate ambition or climate targets. So briefly, that's what I can say. But for the individual, it is mostly about behavioral change. We need to change our consumption patterns. If we go to the local communities and those of us living in the cities, we will note that our consumption patterns are different. Our colleagues in the villages, if they find an empty bottle, they would want to reuse it or recycle it. But in the cities like my city, you find these thrown all over the city as if they are flowers. bottles, plastic papers. But in the rural areas, their consumption to this wasteful and habits that emit more emissions is minimal, unlike those of us in the cities. So behavioral change and change in consumption patterns so that we commit to the transition period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stella. And then I give the floor to Jannie.
Yes, thank you. I will probably take on where Stella left us, but we all have a responsibility of creating a better world than we found it in. We all have a responsibility to Mother Earth and to nature, even though we might be disconnected more from it within the cities. I know as much as there are some people who did not create the climate change crisis and who are still paying for it and who are still acknowledging that they also have responsibilities. And I think that you have different responsibilities as an individual, of course, but policies can steer the individuals in a clearer path, in a direction. And that is why we have politicians, that we want them to create policies for us to create a better world. And of course, money clouds our minds, and industries' minds are very clouded when it comes to climate crisis, and they measure their impact on the world differently than maybe individuals or others. And of course, then policies have a huge responsibility for making it a just transition, for keeping it just of what are the responsibilities of the public, and having it just in relation to what the industries are earning and getting and destroying and developing. And whatever structures that and tools that the policies have as finance, as legislation, which they should use, and we should force them to use them for the next generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jannie. And then Mr. Tanguy. Are you there?
Yes.
Yes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think there are already, my predecessor said some great things already about the role of UK and the different role that public and private sector can have. Maybe on the private and public sector, yes, it's clear that we need the public money, we need the public action, because it's clear that we need to send a signal to everybody on the earth to align their policies, their action on our climate change agenda. But I want to maybe to talk about something different. It's adaptation. On mitigation, we can have a lot of private industry. We can put money. They can make money because there is a kind of economic model behind a lot of mitigation action. But in Africa, we have a lot of problem with adaptation. And in this, it's clear that we need to have public money, public action in that, because adaptation, it's really similar to development action. When you want to build a road or something to protect your population or an infrastructure, people can say yes, but it's also a kind of development action. So we don't want to put money on that. And so there is a real problem for African country to access money in adaptation or clear action from public partner or private partner in adaptation. So we need to think what can be the solution in that. I know that we have a lot of discussion on the role of the private sector in climate finance. And of course, they focus on mitigation, because one of the main goals of Paris Agreement is to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emission, but they are equally important. And this is something that we need to take care as African countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the last speaker, Peter.
Thank you so much. Very good things have been said. I just want to add that if we want to come to sustainability, then we have to embrace change. And it's the same with ordinary people as with industrialists and politicians. We have to embrace change in a way, and we also have to be a little more bold and brave to do that. And for especially politicians like me, I think it's really crucial that we have politicians that dare to regulate in a way, because I'm working with aid, but the big money in the world is not coming with aid. It's the big money that we have to regulate so they go in the right direction, so they don't go back to investments in fossil fuels, so they don't go to infrastructures that are destructive. And I would say that the problem is that all politicians want to be re-elected or elected for the first time. But if not people are electing them, the ones that won't change and dare to do the change, then we will never get the change. Because in the end, it's about what people know and dare to say, and the ones they are electing. And it's about the same with industrialists. If they don't know that their money and the investments are being paid off by good, smart regulations that are future-oriented, then they will go on, put the money in the same pockets that they did before, and the result will be a continuing catastrophe. So we have to embrace change, and that's also for us that living in a countryside far away as well, for the Sami people. In a way, we have to embrace change, but that's for making the world sustainable and have something left of the nature. We cannot go on like this, and that is the big problem, and the thing we have to take if we want this climate change to be stopped.
Thank you very much, Peter. We are reaching the end of this webinar, and I will very, very quickly go to Simon Murdoch now. He has produced this panel. So, Simon, what are the main outcomes of this discussion as you see it?
I'm very happy with the discussion because I think that it rose some new questions in the sense of accountability for the changes that are going to take place. We hope, and when we talk about a green transition, that this isn't something that we can take for granted. Both Jannie and Stella talked about the need to provide accountability for the risks involved in any transition, not to detract from its urgency, but to increase the effectiveness of the measures that are taken to provide accountability in transition. So that's a very important point, I think, for all of us who support a green transition in this discussion. Also, I think that Tanguy and Peter raised the urgency of our discussion by talking, in Tanguy's case, about the two great challenges of our time and of building resilience. And again, Stella was so strong on that issue from an African perspective also. And then in the latter part of the discussion, I think it was great to bring in the reality of the situation, both by Bob and Peter, and indeed by our African contributors talking about the 100 billion pledge, which hasn't been honoured thus far. So I think that there was a richness to the conversation, which ended on quite a realistic note, and should act as a spur to policymakers to bring more urgency and more reality to this debate. I would say that perhaps we didn't make the link between certain factors, including migration and climate change. One terrifying statistic is that for each degree that the world's climate rises, we're facing the prospect of 1 billion people being displaced from areas in which they can live from the climate niche. So this has been something that we've known for a long time, and we must take advantage of this paradigm shift, as Tanguy has described it, to act responsibly and urgently.
Thank you, Simon. And then I will just finish this by thanking you all for being here. I think it has been a very, very interesting discussion, and I hope we will continue it in other forms, in other places. I think there is some parts I would like to also say something more about, and I think it was Jannie who said that sustainability should not be just a word somewhere. And as a politician, I know very well how we try to get the word sustainability or a sustainable manner into the different documents everywhere. And because it's important for us as ecologists, as Green Party members, but then to make it really reality, that is the big problem. Everybody can agree upon putting the word there, but then not everybody is trying to fulfill it. And that is the big challenge as I see it, also when it comes to the political arena. And I do believe really that with legislation we can come far, and we have to work on legislation in very many areas in the north and in the south, and also with the targets, because for example in Africa, many countries, they have really fulfilled many of the targets that we have put in front of us, and for a long time. Now with the Sustainable Development Goals, that is also included, the North, the rich countries are also included. We also have to do more. And as Peter said, we have to embrace change. I think that is very, very important. And the change is coming, whether we want it or not, but we will see change. And especially after this era of COVID and pandemic and disasters, if we don't change, the disasters to come will be so much worse. So we really need to embrace the word change and also do it in practice, not only in the theory. And Simon, if we would have put also migration into this seminar, we would have needed another hour at least. Well, thank you very much for all of you who came to the panel, and for all of you who worked to make it possible. Yeah, Kieran, Simon, everybody, and also Bob coming from with a UK perspective. So thank you very much. And with that, I finish this webinar. Thanks.